February 17th, 1944, 3:42 p.m. The Pacific sun was blazing over a Japanese airbase carved into a thin strip of sand and palm trees along the coastline. Mechanics were rolling two P-21 bombers onto the runway, their engines coughing to life, when a ground controller inside the tower froze mid-sentence. Something moved across the sky fast, too low to belong there. He leaned forward, pressing his headset tighter. Unidentified aircraft, low altitude, moving left to right. Very personate, andament. The words barely left his mouth before a deep twin-engine roar swept across the base. Every crewman on the flight line turned their heads at once. A black silhouette, long wing, twin booms, shark-like nose cut across the airfield barely 50 feet above the hangars. It was gone in a heartbeat, nothing but a blur and the trailing rumble of heavy engines. For a moment, no one spoke. They simply stared at the empty air, trying to process what had just flashed overhead. One mechanic shouted, "American!" Another answered, "Impossible. Their night fighter can't fly like that." But the first hint had already come and gone. They just didn't know it yet. A second later, the ground shuddered. An explosion tore through Hangar 3, fire erupting upward in a column so tall it swallowed the sky above the base. Shattered metal rained down across the runway. A bomber inside vanished in the blast. Alarms went off across the field. Radio operators yelled for anti-air crews to respond. Pilots sprinted from the ready shack, helmets half-strapped, trying to understand how an American aircraft slipped past their defenses in broad daylight. Up above the rising smoke, something dark banked away toward the coastline. It was the same silhouette, the same impossible shape. A P-61 Black Widow. But the men on the ground couldn't believe it. The P-61 was supposed to be a night hunter, slow, heavy, built for darkness and radar. Not a low-flying predator capable of slipping past an entire base like a ghost. Yet here it was. And it wasn't finished. Inside the tower, the chief controller gave the order to launch every bomber still operational. They had to get airborne. They had to escape. But as the second Ki-21 rolled toward the runway threshold, another shadow passed over the field. The men below felt the first spark of fear. Whatever this American aircraft was doing, it wasn't attacking like any fighter they knew. It was stalking them. And in the next 80 minutes, 4 bombers would vanish one by one. February 17th, 1945, 3:49 p.m. The smoke rising from Hangar 3 had thickened into a towering black column that twisted upward like a storm cloud, casting a dark shadow across the entire airfield as the sea breeze pushed its edges inland. The heat from the explosion shimmered above the metal roofs, bending the light and distorting the silhouettes of men running between the burning structures. Far beyond the runway, waves crested lazily against the shore, completely indifferent to the chaos unfolding less than 100 yards away. From the control tower's upper windows, the base commander scanned the coastline, desperately searching for any sign of the intruding aircraft that had sliced across the sky only moments earlier. He could see mechanics dragging hoses toward the burning hangar, while others scrambled to pull an intact bomber out from the collapsing doorway, each movement frantic and disjointed as debris continued to fall from the smoke plume. Even with the sunlight blazing overhead, the airfield felt unnervingly dim, as if the black smoke had swallowed half the afternoon sky. A nervous junior officer leaned over the plotting table, adjusting his binoculars and insisting he had glimpsed the mysterious aircraft disappearing behind the palms at the far end of the island. The commander wanted to believe it was a mistake, because nothing in their manuals or intelligence reports suggested that a nocturnal American fighter could maneuver at treetop level with that kind of precision and speed. Every assumption they held about enemy capabilities was being tested, and the creeping realization unsettled him more than the explosion that had just torn apart an entire hangar. Down on the flight line, the second Ki-21 bomber continued its slow taxi toward the runway threshold, its engines vibrating against the tarmac as the crew tried to block out the chaos surrounding them. They had orders to take off immediately, even though no one understood where the attack had come from or whether more strikes were imminent. The pilot gripped his controls tightly, glancing repeatedly at the smoke column in his peripheral vision, silently praying that whatever ghost had just struck them would not return before he reached takeoff speed. Near the fuel trucks at the far end of the field, several ground crewmen crouched low, pointing toward the coastline where a faint glint briefly appeared above the treetops. At first they thought it was sunlight reflecting off a stray piece of debris, but the flash moved with deliberate intent, sliding left to right before dipping out of sight again. An uneasy murmur spread among them, because that glint had come from the same direction the intruder had vanished minutes earlier, and the timing felt far too precise to be coincidence. The control tower received another fragmented radio transmission from a lookout station near the southern ridge, claiming he had heard twin engines growling somewhere beyond the tree line. The commander's pulse quickened, and he ordered all anti-air batteries to stand ready, though he knew they were poorly positioned for an enemy flying so dangerously low. He could feel the situation slipping beyond control, not because of the damage already done, but because they were fighting something they still couldn't see. And as the smoke from Hangar 3 thickened and drifted across the runway, casting long shadows beneath the wings of the waiting bombers, a chilling thought settled over everyone on the base. The American aircraft hadn't left at all. It was circling somewhere close, hidden behind the palms in the sunlight, studying them with the quiet patience of a hunter preparing its next strike. The airfield's confusion intensified as the thick smoke drifted across the taxiway, forcing ground crewmen to shield their eyes while trying to maintain sightlines on the bombers still preparing for departure. Every few seconds, a gust of wind pushed the smoke into new pockets of the base, revealing brief glimpses of scorched metal, shattered roofing, and fuel fires that refused to die. The explosion had stunned everyone, yet the real fear came from the uncertainty of where the unseen attacker would strike next. Inside the cockpit of the second P-61, the pilot struggled to hold his composure as he received rapid, overlapping instructions from the control tower, each command sounding more desperate than the last. He could feel the engines vibrating beneath him, steady but tense, as if the aircraft itself sensed something stalking the perimeter of the base. His co-pilot scanned the sky nervously, insisting he had seen movement near the treetops, though nothing stayed visible long enough to confirm a target worth reporting. On the runway's edge, a group of mechanics sprinted between tool carts and fuel tanks, waving frantically at the bomber crew to hurry their takeoff before the attacker returned. Their voices were barely audible over the engines and alarms, yet the urgency in their gestures told the crew everything they needed to know. Everyone on the ground understood the danger of staying exposed, because whatever had passed overhead minutes earlier had done so with a precision that defied logic or expectation. The tower issued a warning to all personnel to prepare for another potential low-altitude strike, but even the officers relaying the message sounded unsure of how to defend against a threat they still couldn't see clearly. Reports conflicted wildly, with some claiming the aircraft had climbed toward the clouds, while others insisted it had dipped behind the palms near the coastline. The commander dismissed none of them, because every contradictory sighting reinforced the same terrifying conclusion. The attacker moved with calculated unpredictability. At the far edge of the field, two anti-air gunners rotated their weapons toward the ocean, hands trembling slightly as they attempted to track every flicker of light across the waves. They whispered among themselves about rumors of an American night fighter capable of operating in near darkness, but neither believed such a machine could maneuver with the agility required to thread between hangars and treetops. Yet the evidence lay smoking in front of them, and the impossible now felt disturbingly plausible. The Japanese crew preparing the third bomber scrambled to load equipment, dropping tools as the radios erupted with overlapping shouts about an unidentified silhouette briefly emerging from behind the smoke column. For a moment, the entire field seemed to pause, listening for the low growl of the intruder's engines, but the sky remained silent except for the steady crackle of burning timber and collapsing metal beams. That silence unnerved them more than the roar itself, because only a disciplined predator could disappear so completely after an attack. As the bomber ahead began rolling toward the center line, the pilot felt a cold rush of unease tightening in his chest, not from the destruction behind him, but from the growing awareness that the enemy aircraft wasn't circling randomly. It was choosing when to reveal itself, studying their reactions, probing weaknesses with the patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect opening. The thought gnawed at him as he advanced the throttles, because he knew deep down that the next strike would not come from where anyone expected. Far beyond the drifting wall of smoke, the aircraft responsible for the chaos swept low across the coastline, its twin engines thundering with a steady, predatory rhythm that seemed to pulse through the air like a warning beat. The P-61 Black Widow, jet black from nose to tail, skimmed just above the waves before pulling upward in a smooth, controlled climb that revealed the full outline of its distinctive twin-boom silhouette. Sunlight flashed across its glossy fuselage, briefly catching the red-white star on its wingtip before the aircraft angled back toward the airfield with deliberate, almost surgical intent. Inside the cockpit, the pilot kept his hands steady on the throttles, guiding the big night fighter with a level of precision that came only from months of operating in the darkest skies of the Pacific. He could feel the airframe vibrating with controlled power, responding immediately to every subtle correction he made as he traced a wide arc that would bring the aircraft behind the smoke plume, now blanketing half the runway. The Black Widow had been designed for silence, patience, and night operations. Yet here it was, in broad daylight, moving with an aggressive confidence few Japanese crews had ever imagined it possessed. Behind him, the radar operator monitored the glowing sweep of his scope, watching the cluster of returns near the runway as the remaining bombers continued to taxi into position. He adjusted the gain slightly, refining the picture until each target appeared as a stable, bright echo that pulsed with unmistakable clarity. Even without darkness to hide behind, the P-61's radar gave them an advantage so profound that daylight hardly mattered. They could see through smoke, terrain, and distance long before the enemy even suspected an attack was coming. The pilot eased the aircraft slightly left, aligning with the path he had taken earlier when he skimmed the roofs of the hangars and disappeared behind the rising smoke. He remembered how the Japanese crews had scattered when he flashed overhead, their panic forming a perfect opening for a second strike that would push the entire base into deeper confusion. The P-61's enormous wingspan gave it the lift needed for these low passes, and its four forward-facing 50 caliber guns, paired with the belly-mounted 20mm cannon, formed a devastating combination, ideally suited for tearing through unarmored bombers on the ground. As he gained altitude, the Black Widow's engines shifted into a deeper, resonant growl, echoing across the coastline and briefly alerting several anti-air gunners who swung their weapons upward in a frantic attempt to spot the source of the sound. Yet, the aircraft remained hidden behind the smoke and glare, revealing only the faintest flicker of movement that vanished as soon as it appeared. The pilot knew the base layout well enough to understand exactly where the gunners were positioned, and he kept his approach angled so the drifting smoke cloud masked his silhouette until the last possible moment. With each passing second, the P-61 moved closer to the perfect attack angle, its approach path tightening as the radar operator confirmed the alignment of the bombers still preparing to launch. The aircraft felt alive beneath the pilot's hands, eager to strike again, carrying a strange mixture of silence and fury that defined every mission flown in the Black Widow's imposing frame. He exhaled slowly, locking his eyes on the narrow gap between two hangars where he planned to reappear, fully aware that the Japanese crews below would not have more than a split second to react once the attack began. And as the P-61 slipped back into the shadow of the smoke column, its engines briefly muted by the shifting wind, the aircraft seemed to vanish entirely, leaving the airfield suspended in a tense, trembling quiet that lasted just long enough for fear to take root in every man who dared look toward the sky. The Japanese base had always relied on its natural isolation for protection, trusting the surrounding jungle, cliffs, and open water to create a buffer that enemy pilots would hesitate to cross. Yet that confidence now felt dangerously misplaced as the smoke curled above the runway, and every man on the field realized their defenses were designed for threats arriving from high altitude, not a predatory aircraft weaving between treetops with near-effortless precision. The anti-air batteries were positioned along the outer perimeter, angled toward the sky in anticipation of level bombers or steep-diving fighters, leaving the low approaches almost completely unguarded. Inside the control tower, the commander studied a crude defense chart pinned to the wall, suddenly noticing how every firing arc formed a wide wedge that opened toward the clouds instead of the coastline. He traced the lines with his finger, understanding too late that the intruder had exploited the exact blind spots they had never considered dangerous. The base had been built before radar became common, and the small, outdated set they had acquired months earlier was barely functional, often overwhelmed by static or interference from nearby hills. It could not track a low-flying aircraft moving close to the water, especially one using smoke and terrain to mask its approach. Down on the flight line, several officers shouted conflicting instructions to the anti-air crews, ordering them first to rotate inland, then shift toward the sea, and finally hold position until the attacker revealed itself again. Their confusion grew worse as reports trickled in that some gunners could hear the aircraft's engines, but still couldn't see anything resembling a clear silhouette. Without reliable radar or coordinated spotting, each crew operated in isolation, trying to guess where the next threat might appear, effectively reducing their defensive network to scattered pockets of nervous men aiming into empty sky. Near the southern revetments, A group of technicians huddled behind sandbags as they debated whether the attacker could truly be the American night fighter, rumored to possess a powerful radar system capable of seeing through darkness and cloud cover. Several dismissed the idea immediately, arguing that such a machine would be too heavy and unwieldy to maneuver at the frighteningly low altitude witnessed moments earlier. Others insisted that only an aircraft guided by advanced instruments could disappear so completely and then reappear at the perfect angle for another strike. Their disagreement revealed an uncomfortable truth. None of them knew enough about American capabilities to understand what they were facing. Meanwhile, the bomber crews preparing for takeoff felt the pressure building with every passing moment, aware that their aircraft were exceptionally vulnerable on the ground. The P-61 and G-4M bombers had earned reputations for range and payload, but their lightly built frames and unprotected fuel lines made them dangerously susceptible to gunfire, especially from the heavy cannons mounted on the intruder. The pilot of the third bomber whispered to his co-pilot that taking off now felt like stepping into open water while a shark circled just beneath the surface, unseen but unmistakably close. The commander finally ordered all available units to reinforce the runway area, but the movement itself created new weaknesses as soldiers sprinted across exposed ground without any overhead cover. His voice cracked slightly when he repeated the command, because he knew every second spent reorganizing defenses was another second the enemy could use to study their reactions. The base had been designed for predictable threats, and the sudden arrival of a silent, low-flying predator shattered that sense of predictability, leaving the entire garrison reacting in slow, disjointed fragments instead of acting with unified purpose. As the smoke thickened and the men strained to hear any hint of approaching engines, an unspoken realization settled across the airfield. Their greatest vulnerability wasn't the damaged hangar or the missing bomber. It was the frightening possibility that their enemy understood these blind spots better than they did. And somewhere beyond the haze, the P-61 Black Widow was preparing to exploit those weaknesses once again. For weeks before the attack, whispers had circulated quietly through the barracks and maintenance sheds, telling of bombers that vanished during routine night missions without leaving any debris or final radio call behind. Most officers dismissed these disappearances as navigational errors caused by storms or mechanical failures, but the pattern had grown too precise for the more experienced crewmen to ignore. Each loss occurred along the same patrol corridor, always under moonless skies, and always without warning, as if something unseen had been waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. Several pilots had attempted to raise concerns with their superiors, explaining that strange flickers seemed to appear on the horizon just before radio contact with the missing aircraft abruptly ended. Their reports referenced faint glints of metal catching starlight or silhouettes moving against cloud cover, yet none of those sightings lasted long enough to be recorded officially. The command staff blamed exhaustion or imagination, insisting that no American aircraft possessed the range, speed, or radar capability to stalk Japanese bombers across open water at night. Those assumptions now felt painfully outdated as smoke from the ruined hangar drifted across the airfield. Young mechanics who had worked on the lost bombers remembered how the crews returned from earlier flights visibly shaken, describing sudden drops in altitude forced by turbulence that seemed artificial rather than natural. Some insisted they had heard engine noise behind them moments before the disappearances began, though no visual confirmation ever followed. These accounts were quietly set aside because they failed to match established intelligence, and the base leadership believed such stories would only damage morale among an already stretched bomber force. Yet those same dismissed warnings now resurfaced in hushed tones as men glanced nervously toward the coastline. Inside the Ready Shack, a veteran navigator recounted a particularly unsettling incident from 2 weeks prior, when a Ki-21 he escorted vanished mid-flight after reporting a shadow that matched its speed for nearly 10 minutes. He confessed that he had not reacted quickly enough because he dismissed the shadow as a cloud formation, only realizing the truth after the bomber's radio fell silent. His guilt weighed heavily on him now, especially as the men around him listened with wide eyes, connecting his account to the devastation unfolding outside their walls. The idea that an enemy aircraft could approach undetected at night had seemed unthinkable until today's daylight attack proved otherwise. Among the enlisted crews running ammunition to the defensive positions, fragments of these old stories blended with fresh panic as they watched the smoke column towering above the runway. They muttered nervously about a single American aircraft capable of eliminating multiple bombers with surgical precision, a predator that chose when to reveal itself and when to disappear completely. Some claimed the Black Widow used a ghost radar, that could see through clouds, smoke, and even jungle canopy, while others believed its engines were intentionally tuned to mask their sound until the last possible second. Fear magnified these theories, giving the unseen attacker an almost supernatural aura. The base commander, reviewing loss reports from the previous month, felt a heavy realization tightening in his chest as he connected the older vanishings with the frightening attack now unfolding before him. He recognized too late that the earlier disappearances were not accidents or misfortune, they were warnings he had failed to interpret. Whatever had hunted his bombers at night had simply changed its hunting ground, emerging in full daylight to exploit the confusion and weaknesses that had been ignored for far too long. Each missing bomber had been a message, and today's destruction was the clearest message yet. As the chaos on the airfield settled into a tense, trembling silence, every man sensed that the enemy aircraft circling somewhere beyond the smoke was not just another nuisance or isolated threat. It was a seasoned hunter returning to familiar prey, armed with knowledge gained from weeks of watching them falter. And with every lost bomber, the stakes grew higher, pushing the fear of the unseen predator deeper into the hearts of everyone still waiting for the next strike. Far beyond the drifting smoke that curled over the airfield, the P-61 held a steady path along the coastline, its engines producing a deep, vibrating growl that blended almost seamlessly with the sound of distant surf breaking against the rocks. Inside the cockpit, the pilot watched the landscape slide beneath him in smooth, controlled motion, noting how the sunlight reflected off the roofs of the hangars and traced bright streaks along the runway, where the bombers were still struggling to form up. He understood the precise geometry of the battlefield from this angle, recognizing every blind spot the defenders relied upon, and every mistake they had unknowingly repeated. Behind him, the radar operator leaned forward over his glowing scope, adjusting the gain until the return sharpened into crisp, pulsing echoes that mapped the Japanese airfield with near-perfect clarity. He identified 2 bombers taxiing toward the takeoff line, and a handful of smaller contacts moving erratically across the service roads, likely ground crew scrambling to salvage whatever remained operational. The radar sweep passed across the coastline again, revealing no signs of enemy fighters airborne, confirming that their approach remained uncontested and that the defenders were reacting in fragmented, poorly coordinated bursts rather than unified strategy. The pilot banked slightly to the right, feeling the P-61 respond with the same smooth resistance he had come to trust during countless night interceptions across the Pacific. He lowered the nose just enough to bring the smoke column back into view, using it as both a navigational reference and a visual curtain to conceal his re-entry toward the airfield. Even in daylight, the Black Widow moved with an eerie subtlety, its dark paint absorbing sunlight rather than reflecting it, allowing the aircraft to disappear into shadows cast by clouds or the terrain below. As they closed the distance, the radar operator called out the updated range to the nearest bomber, noting that the target had reached the midpoint of the taxiway and was accelerating as if hoping to escape before the next strike arrived. The pilot smiled faintly, recognizing the pattern of behavior common among crews under sudden pressure, because hurried takeoffs often made aircraft predictable. He nudged the throttles forward, feeling the twin engines surge in response, pushing the aircraft into a shallow descent that would place them directly behind the rising smoke before emerging at the perfect attack angle. Through the canopy, he glimpsed the airfield once more, observing the disorder that spread outward from the destroyed hangar like ripples on a pond. Fire crews struggled against the flames, anti-air batteries rotated in conflicting directions, and officers shouted instructions that were lost in the roar of engines and collapsing debris. Each element reinforced the same truth he and his radar operator had already concluded. The defenders were overwhelmed, disoriented, and completely unaware of where their unseen predator had gone. This was the exact scenario the P-61 had been designed to exploit, transforming chaos into opportunity with every calculated movement. The radar operator confirmed the alignment again, noting that the bomber's signal flickered slightly as smoke drifted across the runway, providing additional cover for their approach. He called out the closure rate, calculating how quickly they would overtake the target once they emerged from behind the curtain of dark, swirling haze. The pilot adjusted his trajectory by only a few degrees, trusting his partner's readings and the aircraft's inherent stability, allowing the Black Widow to glide with quiet confidence toward the point where the next strike would begin. A final reading came through the intercom. The bomber had reached the threshold and would likely attempt takeoff within the next minute, making the timing of their reveal critical. The pilot steadied his breathing, guided the nose along the narrow corridor of clean air between the treetops and the drifting smoke, and prepared for the moment when the airfield would once again fall within clear sight. Every detail aligned perfectly: radar returns, engine thrust, attack vector, and he understood with complete certainty that the next pass would send another shockwave through the already fractured Japanese defenses. And as the P-61 descended through the smoky veil, its dark silhouette became one with the shadows once again, waiting for the precise heartbeat when the hunter would strike from the sky. As the P-61 emerged from the drifting wall of smoke, the airfield opened before the pilot like a stage lit by fire and sunlight, revealing every panicked movement of the ground crews, scrambling to salvage whatever remained functional. The momentary clarity gave him the perfect opportunity to confirm the target's position, and he immediately recognized the bomber ahead as the same one his radar operator had been tracking with meticulous precision. Its engines were already roaring at full power, its nose pointed down the runway in a desperate attempt to escape before the intruder could return. The pilot pushed the throttles forward, feeling the Black Widow accelerate with a heavy, confident surge that vibrated through the airframe and filled the cockpit with a deep mechanical growl. He aligned his trajectory with the runway's edge, careful to remain just above the rising smoke so he could drop into firing position before the bomber's crew had any chance to react. For a single heartbeat, the sunlight reflected perfectly off the bomber's fuselage, marking it as a clear silhouette against the runway, a target that needed only the slightest correction before the attack could begin. Inside the bomber, the pilot sensed something was wrong even before he saw the shape materializing through the haze. The sudden shift in engine tone echoed faintly through the open window of his cockpit, and instinct told him that the threat he feared most had returned. He shouted for full throttle, urging the overloaded bomber to accelerate faster, but the heavily built aircraft responded sluggishly, its long wings dragging through the shimmering waves of heat rising from the burning hangar behind them. His co-pilot scanned the sky and froze, staring at the black shape descending with unmistakable intent. Back in the P-61, the radar operator gave the final clearance to fire, calling out the closure rate with a steady voice that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding on the runway below. The pilot steadied his hand, letting the nose dip just enough to bring the forward guns into perfect alignment with the target. Through the gun sight, the bomber's tail filled the reticle, shaking slightly as heat distortion flickered across the air. He exhaled slowly, trusting the timing, the alignment, and the knowledge gained from countless night engagements where precision mattered more than speed. Then he squeezed the trigger. A burst of bright tracers erupted from the Black Widow's forward guns, streaking through the smoky air with a sharp, violent clarity that cut across the sunlit runway like glowing threads. The rounds slammed into the bomber's fuselage, punching through its thin skin and igniting fuel lines that had already been stressed by the frantic attempt to escape. For an instant, the bomber continued forward, its engines howling in protest, before a sudden flash erupted beneath its wing, sending a rolling wave of fire across the tarmac. The blast knocked several ground crewmen off their feet, filling the air with debris and shockwaves strong enough to shake nearby structures. Flames shot upward in a twisting column, engulfing the bomber in a cloud of burning fragments and shredded metal that scattered across the runway like sparks from a forge. Inside the tower, officers stared in stunned silence, unable to process how quickly the aircraft had been reduced to a smoldering wreck by a single, decisive strike. The P-61 climbed smoothly away from the explosion, vanishing behind the thick curtain of smoke as if it had never been there at all. Its engines muted again, swallowed by the wind and the roar of the burning wreckage below, leaving the defenders struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. The sudden reappearance, the precise timing, and the devastating force of the attack created an almost supernatural impression, as though the aircraft had materialized from the shadows purely to deliver a single lethal blow before slipping away again. On the ground, the remaining bomber crews felt a cold weight settle in their stomachs as they realized how little control they had over the battle unfolding around them. If the attacker could strike with such precision under perfect visibility, then there was no telling what it might be capable of once it returned to the concealment of smoke, sun, and coastal terrain. The first strike had been swift, deliberate, and merciless, and everyone on the field understood that it would not be the last. The explosion from the first strike had barely begun to settle when the P-61 slipped back into the drifting smoke, letting the swirling haze swallow its silhouette until even its dark wings blended seamlessly with the rising column of debris. The pilot held the aircraft steady at low altitude, listening to the distant rumble of burning fuel and collapsing metal as he guided the Black Widow into a shallow turn that tucked them neatly behind the curtain of blackened air. Every movement he made felt deliberate and unhurried, as though the aircraft itself understood the value of remaining invisible until the moment of absolute advantage returned. Behind him, the radar operator adjusted the gain on his scope, watching the echoes smear and sharpen as the P-61 moved between dense pockets of smoke and open coastal air. He could still see the remaining bombers attempting to reposition, each bright return flickering as rising heat distorted their outlines. The operator spoke quietly into the intercom, describing their movements with the calm cadence of someone reading a map rather than monitoring a battlefield. His voice provided the rhythm for their hunt, guiding the aircraft through blind spots the defenders didn't even realize existed. The pilot dipped the left wing slightly, aligning the Black Widow with a shallow arc that followed the natural curve of the tree line bordering the airfield. He kept the engines throttled back to reduce noise, allowing the sound of burning debris and distant shouting to mask their presence. Each second spent in the shadows gave him a clearer sense of the defenders' panic, and he could practically feel the confusion spreading across the runway as ground crews failed to determine where the attacker had gone. The true strength of the P-61's design emerged here, not in raw speed or firepower, but in its ability to stalk a target with predatory patience. As they crept forward, the radar operator confirmed that one bomber had begun edging toward the far end of the runway, attempting to put as much distance between itself and the burning wreckage as possible. The operator's scope pulsed with the steady glow of the moving return, providing a perfect beacon for the next strike. The pilot banked slightly, keeping the P-61 low enough that even watchtowers would struggle to distinguish its outline against the black smoke drifting above the treetops. He wanted the aircraft to remain a rumor until the instant its weapons spoke again. Crossing the coastline, the Black Widow skimmed just above the water, using the ocean's reflective glare to distort its silhouette and make visual spotting nearly impossible. The aircraft's dark paint absorbed the midday light rather than reflecting it, turning the P-61 into a shifting shadow that vanished the moment a cloud passed overhead. Only the faint gleam of the canopy betrayed its presence occasionally, though even that disappeared as the pilot angled the nose back toward the airfield, ensuring the sun sat directly behind them for the approach. The radar operator announced the closure rate again, noting that the bomber was still accelerating but remained predictable in its path, locked into a straight line born more from panic than strategy. The pilot eased the throttles forward, letting the engines shift from a muted rumble to a deeper, more assertive growl that resonated through the cockpit. He kept the aircraft masked behind the last sliver of smoke until the precise moment when action would replace patience, because revealing themselves too early would grant the enemy a chance to react. The Black Widow's power lay in denying that opportunity. As the final layer of haze thinned and sunlight washed across the canopy, the P-61 began to rise from the shadows with the controlled, inevitable movement of a predator emerging from tall grass. The pilot could already see the bomber ahead, its frame shimmering in the heat as it crept toward the runway's far edge, unaware that the hunter had returned. Every factor, sun position, smoke thickness, radar clarity, wind direction aligned perfectly, creating the narrow moment when stealth, speed, and timing merged into a single lethal tactic. And as the P-61 surged forward, leaving the concealment of the tree line and revealing only a brief flash of dark wings against the sky, the defenders finally understood that the predator had never truly left. It had simply been waiting for them to make their next mistake. The moment the P-61 cleared the final veil of smoke, the pilot pushed the throttles forward with a smooth, confident motion, letting the twin engines surge into a powerful climb that aligned them directly behind the second bomber, inching its way toward the runway. The Japanese aircraft struggled under the weight of its fully loaded frame, wobbling slightly as its wheels rolled through patches of debris scattered from the earlier explosion. The crew inside had no idea the hunter had reappeared above them, hidden momentarily in the shimmering distortion rising from the burning wreckage. Inside the cockpit of the bomber, the pilot shouted for increased throttle, desperate to put distance between his fragile aircraft and the burning hangar, still collapsing behind them. He felt an uneasy vibration running through the fuselage, unsure whether it came from the uneven surface of the runway or from something far more dangerous closing in from above. His co-pilot leaned toward the side window, squinting through the drifting haze, but saw only the wavering silhouette of palm trees bending in the coastal wind. Above them, the P-61 leveled out just long enough for the radar operator to refine the range, calling out precise numbers that confirmed the attacker's advantage had grown overwhelming. The pilot aligned his gun sight with the bomber's tail, noting how the sunlight reflected off the aircraft's unarmored skin, turning it into an exposed target against the bright runway. He steadied the aircraft for a heartbeat, letting the reticle settle perfectly, before squeezing the trigger and unleashing a focused burst of 20mm fire that tore through the bomber's rear section with violent force. The impact shook the bomber like a physical blow, sending sparks and fragments spiraling across the tarmac as flames erupted from the ruptured fuel line beneath the fuselage. The pilot inside screamed for the crew to bail out, but the aircraft was already veering uncontrollably, its damaged wing dragging it toward the edge of the runway. Within seconds, the bomber clipped a service truck, igniting another explosion that engulfed both vehicles in a roiling fireball visible from every corner of the airfield. The P-61 banked away smoothly, using the rising column of flames as cover while repositioning for its next attack. The radar operator scanned the field again, quickly locating the third bomber that had begun to taxi in the opposite direction, likely hoping to escape by turning away from the chaos erupting near the main runway. Its slower movement and isolated path made it an even easier target, and the operator calmly relayed the vector needed to intercept it before it could gain enough speed to take off. The pilot descended in a controlled arc, bringing the Black Widow low over the treetops so the aircraft's dark silhouette blended with the shifting shadows cast by the afternoon sun. He angled toward the bomber's path, anticipating its movements with the practiced instinct of someone who had hunted dozens of aircraft under far more challenging conditions. When the P-61 emerged from behind the final row of palms, the Japanese crew spotted the approaching shadow too late to react meaningfully, their startled shouts lost beneath the roar of the bomber's overstrained engines. This time, the pilot fired early, letting a stream of .50 caliber rounds walk across the bomber's right wing before switching to the 20mm cannon that delivered the decisive blow. The rounds struck the fuel tank beneath the wing root, igniting a violent burst of flame that tore the aircraft open from the inside and sent burning fragments scattering across the service road. The bomber lurched sideways, its wing collapsing as fire consumed the cockpit, before sliding into a ditch where the blaze grew into a towering plume that joined the other dark pillars already staining the sky. As the P-61 climbed away once more, disappearing into the drifting smoke with the same uncanny subtlety that characterized every previous movement, the remaining Japanese crews felt their morale collapse under the weight of what they had just witnessed. 2 bombers destroyed in less than a minute, each unable to take off, defend itself, or even understand the direction of the attack. The hunter's precision had become unmistakable, and the message it delivered was brutally clear. The Black Widow wasn't merely striking targets, it was dismantling the entire airfield, one burning aircraft at a time. The destruction of the second and third bombers sent shockwaves through the airfield, pushing the remaining crews into a frantic scramble to launch the final operational aircraft before the unseen hunter could strike again. The fourth bomber, a Ki-21 positioned near the far end of the auxiliary taxiway, had already begun rolling forward, its engines straining at maximum power as the crew attempted to escape the inferno steadily consuming the base behind them. Smoke drifted across the taxiway in uneven patches, occasionally revealing glimpses of burning wreckage that only deepened the pilot's desperation to get airborne. Inside the cockpit, the commander of the bomber force barked for immediate takeoff, insisting that altitude offered the only remaining chance of survival against an attacker capable of striking with such terrifying precision on the ground. His co-pilot nodded anxiously, eyes fixed on the wavering horizon where heat shimmered above the treetops, turning everything into a distorted blur. The gunners in the rear positions scanned frantically for any sign of the black aircraft, their hands trembling as they gripped weapons they knew would be nearly useless against a target approaching with this level of discipline and speed. High above the coastline, the P-61 circled in a wide, deliberate arc, using altitude to assess the ruined airfield with the cold, calculating clarity of a predator studying the last remaining prey. The radar operator tracked the fourth bomber's movement across the glowing sweep of his scope, watching its return pulse with increasing steadiness as it reached the threshold of the auxiliary runway. He relayed the updated vector, closure rate, and escape direction with quiet precision, knowing the bomber's attempt to flee toward open water would create the exact approach corridor the Black Widow needed. The pilot pushed the nose of the P-61 downward, allowing the aircraft to slip into a long, descending glide that would place them directly behind the drifting smoke column still rising from the earlier explosions. From this angle, sunlight reflected harmlessly across the Black Widow's dark wings, disguising its approach as nothing more than a fleeting shadow sliding across the sky. The engines idled at low power, producing only a soft undertone that vanished beneath the roar of the burning runway and the desperate acceleration of the fleeing bomber below. As the bomber reached the far end of the runway, its wheels lifted from the surface with a strained, reluctant motion, climbing slowly into the thickening smoke that hovered above the tree line. The crew believed they had bought a few precious seconds of safety by taking off through the haze, trusting that the obscured visibility would hinder the attackers' ability to track their movements. Yet the very cloud they hoped would save them provided the perfect concealment for the P-61, which emerged from the upper edge of the smoke column like a dark phantom rising from a shrouded battlefield. The radar operator confirmed the final firing solution with steady certainty, calling out the exact moment the bomber's tail entered optimum range. The pilot eased the throttles forward, letting the engines surge into a controlled roar as he aligned the gun sight with the faint silhouette climbing through the haze. For a brief instant, the ascending bomber seemed almost safe, its wings glinting weakly in the fractured sunlight breaking through the drifting smoke. Then the reticle centered, the timing locked, and the final command flowed effortlessly through the cockpit. The pilot squeezed the trigger, releasing a focused burst of 20mm rounds that sliced through the haze like molten spears, tearing into the bomber's right engine with devastating precision. The impact detonated the fuel mixture inside the nacelle, engulfing the wing in a sweeping fireball that illuminated the smoke column with violent orange light. The bomber shuddered, rolled sharply to one side, and began a slow, helpless descent toward the coastline, leaving a twisting trail of black smoke that marked its fatal trajectory. Within seconds, the aircraft struck the water with a heavy, echoing crash, sending a plume of spray into the air before sinking beneath the waves. The P-61 climbed steadily away from the scene, banking into another smooth arc that carried it back into the open sky, as if the final kill had been nothing more than another step in a meticulously executed mission. On the shattered airfield behind them, the surviving Japanese crews could only stare in stunned disbelief, realizing that their last hope of resistance had just vanished beneath the sea. The Hunter had completed its work, one precise strike at a time, until nothing remained capable of escaping its reach. When the final bomber disappeared beneath the churning surface of the coastline, a strange stillness settled over the shattered airfield, as if the entire base had collectively lost the ability to breathe in the aftermath of the relentless assault. The smoke rising from the wrecked hangars drifted upward in heavy, twisting plumes, staining the sky with dark trails that slowly merged into a single column of ash, marking the destruction of an entire bomber force in less than 90 minutes. Men moved cautiously through the debris, stepping around burning fragments and collapsed structures, too stunned to speak as they tried to grasp the scale of what had unfolded before their eyes. Inside the control tower, officers stared wordlessly at the ruined runway, replaying the sequence of attacks in their minds and realizing that each strike had been executed with the cold precision of a hunter dismantling its prey. The commander pressed a shaking hand against the windowsill, feeling the faint vibration of distant explosions still echoing through the ground beneath him. He knew that no amount of preparation or discipline could have stopped an enemy aircraft capable of exploiting every blind spot, every miscalculated assumption, and every failure their defenses had carried for months. The truth settled over him like a weight. The threat had always been there, unseen but undeniable. Scattered across the flight line, ground crewmen sifted through twisted metal and shattered glass, searching for anything that could be salvaged from the wreckage. They whispered quietly among themselves, describing the attacker as a dark phantom that appeared from impossible angles, struck with ruthless clarity, and vanished before anyone could react. Some insisted the aircraft had flown with unnatural silence, while others swore they had seen it materialize directly from the heart of the smoke, as if the clouds themselves had helped conceal its approach. Fear and awe blended together, giving the P-61 a mythic reputation before the fires had even begun to die. Near the auxiliary runway, several pilots gathered beside a crater left by one of the explosions, exchanging fragmented accounts of the moment the attacker executed its final strike. They spoke of how the last bomber had climbed through the haze with desperate determination, only to be engulfed in flame before its crew could even register what was happening. One pilot stared out toward the coastline, imagining the aircraft sinking beneath the